Welcome back, everybody. Wanted to do an update video on the lift. It's been a while and we've learned quite a few things about it, but we do have one big question, and that is, what kind of lift is it? That's the one big question we've got left, and that's important because we think it's going to need some work, and before we start that work we really do need to know what kind of lift it is to see if we can get some diagrams for it, so we know what we're getting ourselves into. But let's talk a little bit about what we've learned. So I'm going to go ahead and raise it here. And we see that the lift is rising. First thing we'll let you know is we didn't know whether or not this lift had a safety leg. It does. It's got an anti-rotator leg, this thing here. This is the safety feature. Last time I raised the lift, I actually removed this pin, so the safety leg didn't go up. I didn't think it had one. As it turns out, it does, although it looks like it may have been added at a later time, because this looks like it's been welded here. So, as we think about the age of this lift, and as we consider what kind of lift it is, I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. This doesn't like to come back down. As we think about what kind of lift this is, we're probably looking in the range of the mid to late 30s or maybe early 1940s. We understand this lift came out of a service station in the mid 60s, so if that service station was 2-3 decades old, we're looking at the 30s, which makes it pretty old. Now, I've learned that lifts at that time, very often they came with a safety leg or they didn't. You could get it as an option. So this one appears to have a safety leg, may have been added at a later time because this became compliance. You had to have this one to be in compliance, to have a non-rotator leg, or cars that fall off. It was seen as dangerous. So let's talk a little bit about the condition of the lift. We had a local company come in and actually help us test this out a couple weeks ago. And what they did is they ran the lift all the way up on the controls here and then built pressure from the air compressor. And what we found is that even though we're putting 130 pounds of pressure from the compressor, we put a gauge on the end of that, and it looks like there's only 20 pounds of pressure being held in the system on the gauge, which means we probably got a break in the air line under the floor. Kind of difficult, because that means we've got to break up the concrete if we're going to want to replace it. Now, the other possibility, or the other thing we were worried about, was whether or not we were leaking hydraulic fluid. This is an air over hydraulic lift, so there's hydraulic fluid in here, but it also takes air pressure to raise it. We were able to get into there and take a look at the fluid. It's real clean, the level is up, so we don't think that it's leaking oil, which is great. And honestly, for an air over hydraulic lift, the oil tends to be held around the piston, and so they don't tend to leak like the full hydraulics do. The full hydraulics would have a separate tank under pressure, and those would rust out and leak, and in some cases create an environmental hazard. That'd be a bad day. So it doesn't look like we've got that problem, but it does look like we've got an airline leak, which comes to the reason why we want to figure out what kind of lift it is. So I reached out to a really great company in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I haven't told them that I'd be making videos, so I won't mention them here, but if later on it becomes appropriate, I'll put them down in the description because they were really helpful. I sent them a couple of pictures of the lift, and they sent me back some ideas of what kind of lift they thought it might be, and that plug in front is the real kicker. So normally for an air over hydraulic lift, you tend to have a plug in the top because the fluid is inside the lift itself. It's very rare for an air over hydraulic lift to have what appears to be a separate reservoir. So I reached out to that company in Scranton, and they said, well, it's tough to tell what kind of lift you have because that is unusual, but they said, our air compressor just shut off. But they said one company that did do a fill pipe in front of the lift was Joyce lifts, and they were popular in the 60s and 70s. So they sent me over a diagram for a Joyce lift, and I did a little bit of investigating. One of the things about the Joyce lift is that, yeah, there is a fill tank in the front, and hydraulic fluid is in the shaft here, but it has a reservoir that kind of surrounds the lift shaft. So almost like a donut, the reservoir surrounds it. The reservoir, if this is a Joyce, the reservoir is just about like a bladder that runs just around the outside of this. It's probably yay deep, and it's got, it's the overflow reservoir for the system. It's not under any pressure, but that's the way that they would do it. So thinking that this might be a Joyce, I actually put a little metal probe down into this thing, and it turns out it doesn't seem to have room inside of a tank like it would be if it was a Joyce. And there were some other things on that diagram that just didn't add up with this lift. So I didn't think it was a Joyce. So I got back with the guy in Scranton. And looking at the top of this, he said, I don't know, and we don't see him very often, but the top of the lift looks like a Curtis. And that was very interesting. So we went going to look for Curtis lift. So you remember, first I thought it was a Globe. Globe is what it says on the handle. Globe was the largest manufacturer of lifts for a long time, of lifts of this style. Joyce was not quite as popular as Globe, but you could still find information on Joyce on the internet. Curtis lifts, you can't find anything about them on the internet. So I looked and looked and looked. Finally, though, on eBay, I found a guy up in Detroit who was selling a 15-page ad brochure for Joyce, for Curtis lifts. Now, you'll probably remember Curtis. They make air compressors. That's really kind of their more famous product. But he was selling a ad for Curtis lifts that Curtis, in the mid-'30s, would provide to gas stations, trying to sell them their lifts. So this was an ad for gas stations that might be interested in buying a lift for their operations. And this was from the mid-'30s, which probably puts this exactly in the right time frame. And there were a couple of really interesting, though low-resolution pictures. One of them appears to show, there are two kinds of Curtis lifts. There's an air-over hydraulic and a full hydraulic. The preview pictures on that listing had a detailed version of the full hydraulic lift, but there was a grainy picture of the semi-hydraulic lift that seemed to show a fill spout coming out of the front, just like here, but the spout goes right back in to the main piston there. And I think that may be what we have. So I actually went ahead and it was relatively cheap. I purchased that booklet. It's on order. My hope is that there is more description of this lift in it that'll help me positively identify it, and maybe even a detailed diagram that'll show me where the air line enters. Hopefully it's not all the way at the bottom of the 9-foot pole underground. But will also show me whether or not a Curtis lift of that era has a fill spot in front of it. Another interesting thing about those Curtis lifts, what you could read from that brochure, is that in the mid-'30s they would sell you a lift with the rotator or without it for the same price. It was an option. You could buy it without it, and this thing would spin all the way around, or you could buy it with, which means if this was from the 30s and it was a Curtis, they may have bought it without or added it later, which is really interesting. So, as we said, finding out what kind it is really important. There's another important problem with this as well. Figuring that we can perhaps dig down, find the break in the pipe, and replace it with something that's not going to rust. This, I think, has been here since 1965, so it makes sense that it rusts. The other issue is that it rocks a little bit, particularly when it's fully extended. Not really great. Understand that the bearing might be bad. So there's a company that makes parts for a lot of these old lifts. Don't know if I can get a bearing. It'll be important to figure out what kind it is to see if I can get one. So that's really two big problems. Can I get to the airline to repair it? And then even if I can do that, can I get a replacement bearing to keep this thing from rocking? Or when I get into it, is it so far gone that there's other damage that makes it unsalvageable? So all those questions still need to be asked, but at least we're getting more answers than we had. And still hoping to put this lift in operation so we can do the car restoration work that we were hoping to accomplish in this garage. Anyway, that's all I know for right now. The next video we hope to do, the day that 15-page brochure arrives in the mail, we will open it together and look and see if it has the answers that we need to positively identify this lift. so we can make a plan to decide whether or not we're going to go after this, tear up the floor, and see if we can make the repairs, or if we've got to still keep digging for information. So I'll let you go until then. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Special thanks to everybody who has helped us as we try to work to identify this lift. A couple of people have commented on the last video, really helpful stuff. Some people say they have a lift very similar to this. If you've had experience with this kind of a lift, if you know anything about a Curtis lift, please let us know. All the information we can gather at this point will be helpful. So thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.